So we begin with history. And the question mark, oh, by the way, we're going to be talking about these not in the order in which you will find them on your handout of the foundations. They're in a little bit of a different order. They're actually the order in which we wrote them, but in part because there's a flow to our thinking today that I want to take you. So we're going to start with history, which I think is perhaps the third or fourth page in your curriculum frameworks. And you know, I think you've already discovered you've got my slides in your packet, and you've also got a copy of all the foundations. Okay, history? History for preschoolers? No. We're talking about a sense of time. And as I had said earlier, that sense of time is related to children's understanding of past events, anticipating and planning future events, personal history, and historical changes in people and the world. Okay. I'd like to engage you in an activity just to start this off. And what I'd like you to do is to take out a piece of paper and a pen, or use one of the markers that's in the bin here. And I'd like you to simply create an informal timeline of your own life. Provide a description of your life using a timeline. And mark the events that would be important for somebody to know if you were introducing yourself to them. Can you do that right now? And people who are remote, please, you also. Okay. So the question is, how do young children think of events in the past? And what we have done is to begin that comparison process. The fact is, though, that young children don't think about events of the past in terms of a continuous timeline the way most adults do. When I asked you to write a timeline, this was not yours because it's a much more extended historical sweep, but none of you had any difficulty with this because you have a sense of time existing linearly into the past up through the present. One could actually project it off into the future, involving events that occurred at identifiable points in time in relation to the events of your own personal past. You know, so most of you perhaps had my birth, when I got married, if you're married, when I had children, if you had children. If you want back into family history, you might have identified a period of time before that. Your grandparents came to this country. Farther before that, more historical events. The U.S. Constitution, way back the dinosaurs. That's natural to us. And yet it's painfully constructed in the period of time in which we're working with children. Most young children experience the past or events of the past as islands in time that are not really sequenced very well. So for them, you know, usually the distinction is not a historical timeline, but just the difference between the recent past that I can remember and long ago. That's, well, it's long ago. And there are different things they know that go into those different categories. Long ago, for example, is the dinosaurs. And then things like cowboys, knights, princesses, pirates, ninjas, dino riders, Jack Sparrow, all are kind of glommed together in this really fairly undifferentiated, but nevertheless part of long ago. The dinosaurs might be part of that group, they might not. Then, not quite in the recent past, but not quite long ago, is when my grandparents were children. In the recent past is when my brother was born. And I started preschool. And we moved to Woodland. I can remember that, on my birthday. And the problem with having the thinking about events in the past as being islands in time is that there's a lot of confusion about when these past events occurred in relation to each other. So for example, when my grandparents were children, does that belong to long ago? Or is that really part more of the recent past? And some of you may recognize this sense of time in the children with whom you work. During the period in which we work with kids and into the early elementary school years, we can find that with their increasing conceptual flexibility, knowledge of past events, and the assistance of adults, preschoolers' mental timeline expands and begins to integrate these events. And the reason the accordion is up here is because I like to think of their sense of time as being very much like an expanding accordion. It initially begins very closed up. You only got two ideas about the past, recent past and long ago. And then as you gain more knowledge of the past, that accordion expands. You begin realizing the dinosaurs weren't the same time as when the cowboys lived. And that's not the same time as when your grandparents were children. And that accordion expands a little bit further. And you realize that there are things that happened when your parents were children that was before you were born. And then there are things that happen after you were born. And the accordion expands. And you learn a little bit more about history, and you begin understanding that the time that the pirates lived was different than the time when the cowboys lived, and the accordion expands, and you learn more about family history. And your grandparents are telling you about what life was like in California when they first moved here, and about their parents who came from Venezuela, and the accordion expands. And as that accordion expands, it not only includes more content about the past, but along with children's growing conceptual skills, it enables children to better sequence those events, to understand what occurred long, long ago compared to events that didn't occur so long ago, and to be able to understand how they're sequenced in relation to each other. And that's how the timeline begins to be constructed. And so we are taking children when the accordion is still very compressed, and through our conversation with them, through the development of their conceptual skills, we're helping them to expand it. And it relates to all aspects of their understanding of the past, both their personal past, their sense of family history, and their understanding of historical events that are outside of their direct experience. Does that make sense? Okay. This is why this is a tremendously exciting time for the kinds of understanding of history that interest us. During the preschool years, there are other accomplishments that are contributing to this process. And one is that they're understanding that there is a sequence to past events. That events don't just occur as islands in time independently of each other or having no relation to each other, but that they can be ordered as one going before the other. And children are beginning to understand when these events occurred in relation to each other. What gets really exciting, but this won't occur until they begin in moving into the primary grades, is when they understand how historical events are causally connected to each other, and how events in their own personal past are causally connected to each other. The latter occurs earlier. Children can begin making connections, for example, between what happened to me yesterday and how I feel today, or between my father going on a trip 2 sleeps ago and is coming home today. So they can begin sequencing events in the personal past long before they can do so with respect to a broader historical sweep. And they can understand how past events relate to each other in the personal past long before they're ready to do that with any sense of historical knowledge. And so they are beginning to understand how past events relate to the present, such as feeling happy today because of yesterday's birthday party. Understanding family history is also part of their learning about how to sequence and order and connect events. This includes understanding the ages of different family members, and that life was different long ago, in one sense, when their parents and grandparents were children. This is why children begin to show an interest along about age 5 or so to the family stories that parents and grandparents can share with them, because it begins to give them a sense of a changing world that they are a part of. There's also this sense of personal history that relates not just to identifying when the family moved to Woodland and when my birthday was and when my brother was born, but understanding a sense of personal past in terms of one's own development. As you might expect, as a developmental psychologist, I find this especially interesting. What young children from very early on, 3, 3.5, 4, possess is a deep pleasure in how their accomplishments compare favorably with what they could not do when they were much younger, right? Children, you'll find 4-year-olds, not only drawing attention to their accomplishments, but specifically commenting that I couldn't do this when I was a baby, or my little sister is a baby and so she can't do this. And it is this wonderful sense of commenting on their own development that is giving them a sense of personal history and of personal growth. I'll comment as an aside, by the way, that this is one of the reasons why children are biased under ordinary circumstances to have a very positive self-regard. And it's partly because in measuring themselves up, they're measuring themselves against what they could not do at an earlier age. All that changes, of course, once they get into school. It's no longer satisfactory to simply say, I couldn't do these things a year ago. Now, of course, teachers are measuring them against other kids of the same age, and that's a much more exacting criterion. That's one of the reasons why self-image, starting off for most kids fairly high in the preschool years, begins to go down as soon as they enter K-12 and just continues its downward descent for several years. It's partly because they're evaluating themselves against more exacting criteria. I've often thought that if we simply take a clue from preschoolers and simply thought to ourselves, well, you know, I didn't know much about history and social science 2 years ago. I'm pretty good. I am growing. I am developing. I'm learning. I do more and I know more than I knew. Then we feel much better about ourselves. But that's also contributing to children's sense of personal past. And then finally, at about age 4.5 to 5, children begin creating and telling autobiographical memories. Autobiographical memories begin with simple accounts of what I had for dinner last night, or how I helped mommy in grocery shopping, or a visitor to our home this morning. But over time, they expand into more in-depth accounts in which what is distinctive about them is that the child is the central player. And it's how I felt and what I did and why I did it and what happened then that accounts for their importantly and uniquely autobiographical quality. Autobiographical memory is an important cornerstone to the development of a sense of personal history. It's also a cornerstone, incidentally, to the development of a sense of self, in the sense that throughout life, but beginning in preschool, it is the autobiographical narratives we tell about ourselves that help us understand who we are and why we came to be that way. If I were to ask you, which I won't because I'm already running behind, if I asked you to write down an early autobiographical memory, we could spend some time talking about why you wrote what you did and what it tells you about yourself. By the way, I will say that when I had my own students do that yesterday, the same thing happened. I had to get the women to stop writing, and the men were done within 60 seconds. Just a sex difference there. Research has shown that when people go through major life transitions, you know, when they experience lots of abrupt changes in marriage, in jobs, in other things relating to personal identity within a few months or years, their autobiographical narratives change. The stories they tell about themselves change because there is now a new self that has to be explained. And as a consequence, these autobiographical narratives, as kids are putting them together, are important. Are listening to their stories, are helping them fill them out by the questions that we ask them, help provide structure and content as they're first developing the narrative of their own lives. Does that make sense? As you're driving home at the end of today, think about the stories you tell about yourself and what they explain about who you are. Okay. So, conversation with an adult contributes to many of these accomplishments. As I said, it contributes to children's autobiographical memory for past events, their awareness of how past events are sequenced in time. That is, when we talk with children, we help to clarify that this happened yesterday, so this is how you feel today. Daddy left for his trip 2 sleeps ago, and so you're really looking forward to seeing him when you come home from preschool. Conversation also helps children connect past events to present events, how past events can affect one's feelings and thoughts now, and conversation is crucial to anticipation of the future, which we're going to turn to in just a moment. So what I've described to you provides then the research foundation for 3 of the substrands in the development of a sense of time. The first of these having to do with understanding past events, and you've got these without the examples in your packet. Remember, they're on a different page than the first page. I should point out, by the way, that if you notice differences in wording between the version that you have and what I have up here, it's because I pulled these out just after I'd finished the final copy edit from C to D. So actually, this is what you'll see when these finally are published later this year. It's very close to the version you have, except for editor's changes. But as you can see, as it relates to understanding past events, the descriptor at around age 48 months, when children are toward the end of their 4th year, describes how children really enjoy recalling past events, but they do have trouble with understanding when these events occurred and with understanding their historical sequence. By about 60 months of age, kids are much, much better at relating past events to other past events. And as you can see in the examples, it illustrates how a child, for example, talks about having had to share a room with her sister in the past, but not now, because her sister is, quote, all grown up and married now. You would not find that in a younger child, the sense of past events being connected in that way. It's at this time that you could begin finding kids being able to use time sequences in order to narrate a story and being able to describe how certain things happened before other things. They've really got that sense. They're beginning to get that sense of time sequence. Is that clear? Does that make sense? So you can see there's a lot to play with here, a lot to work with. Another of the substrands relating to personal history describes, as I've mentioned to you, the ways in which at 48 months, but certainly well before this, kids are proudly displaying their skills and telling about recent experiences. A lot of a sense of child self-esteem and pride is based on eliciting a predictably appreciative reaction from you when they demonstrate their skills. But it's by 60 months of age, just a year later, that they're more spontaneously comparing current and past abilities, as well as telling more detailed autobiographical stories. They are now identifying a personal past that they are beginning to understand as it relates to who they are today. That's going to continue through the rest of life. And then finally, historical changes in people and the world. At 48 months, children do distinguish events in the recent past from those of quote-unquote long ago, but little sense of an historical timeline. In the third example I have up here, they think of fairy tale characters as well as science fiction superheroes as being real but simply not here right now. They're somewhere in the ether of the past, where Spider-Man probably rode dinosaurs or something like that. By 60 months of age, they are very interested, becoming more interested rather, in family history and begin to understand past events in relation to each other. They understand now that dinosaurs lived long ago and Grandpa was a boy long ago. They cannot distinguish how long ago these events occurred, but I should say they also have an awareness that they are not the same long ago. Okay? Now, we haven't talked about anticipating future events, extending that sense of time off to the future. So let's offer some comments about that. In anticipating the future, one of the most important things for us to understand is that young children's mental scripts for everyday events provide a means both of remembering past events as well as of anticipating future events. So when children are telling you about things that have happened in the past, but especially when children are talking about things that are going to happen in the future, it is easiest for them, and they are most readily going to do so, in relation to their overall scripted understanding for the daily and ordinary routine of their lives. Now let's consider what that routine might involve. It might involve having an awareness of waking up in the morning and getting ready, and then going with mommy or daddy to preschool. After preschool, mom picks you up, then you have lunch, and then a nap. Then the babysitter is there when you wake up from the nap. At the end of the day, daddy arrives, there's playtime, dinner, and then that wonderful bedtime routine, story, and sleep. Okay. This would be a very simple script, like a Hollywood script, that a young child would use in organizing their sense of the events of their life. That's why predictability is so important, because much of their sense of regularity and orderliness and predictability to what goes on in their lives is based on having that script and being able to expect that that's how things happen. There's a charming story told by a researcher who's looked at this field of a 4-year-old girl who, because of an unusually vigorous playtime with daddy late in the afternoon, the parents decided that it was a really good idea for her to have her bath before dinner rather than afterwards, because she was hot and messy and all the rest. And were amazed to find that she was sobbing in the bathtub. When they were finally able to get out of her why she was so upset, it became clear that because her script is that the bath time is after dinner time and just before bedtime, there was going to be no dinner tonight. A perfectly reasonable conclusion for a child with that kind of a script. Keeping this in mind, therefore, we understand that children slot in memories of past events whenever they can into that script. You know, for example, if usually mom picks me up and I have lunch, play, then nap time, that's right, I spilled juice on the carpet yesterday when I was having lunch. That's when that happened. I'll slot that memory into that script. And I can remember it in part because I know how it fit in to that particular day's script. And they do the same thing with future events. So there's a babysitter, but I know that instead of a babysitter, mommy says it will visit my abuela tomorrow. So they can anticipate now future events as they become slotted into certain places on the script. Okay? Now, understanding this, of course, gives us powerful tools for helping to structure children's memory of past events, especially if we understand the script into which these events might be slotted. We can help children remember when they occurred and the context in which they might have occurred, as well as how they happened in relation to other events of that day. And we can do the same thing in helping them anticipate things that are going to happen. If there's a change in the preschool routine, we can explain that and help them understand that in relation to what they ordinarily expect the daily script is going to be. And if something special is going to happen in parents' behavior, we can help them anticipate that in relation to when it's going to be slotted into that script. And again, this is why predictable daily routines are so important to young children. This brings us then to the last of the substrands for the sense of time, that of anticipating and planning future events, in which at around 48 months, kids are pretty good at the end of the 4th year, of anticipating events in the near future, particularly with adults' help. It's still tough for a child in the 4th year to be able to anticipate something that might be happening tomorrow or later in the day without an adult explaining it and slotting it into what normally happens during that time. But they can do so with that assistance. By about 60 months of age, they're much, much better at not just anticipating events, but planning for them. That's why anticipation is a powerful conceptual tool to the 5-year-old. It's the ability to make choices with adult assistance that are going to anticipate what I might need then. So as an example, we have a group is getting ready to go on a trip to the fire station, and so a child asks the teacher whether they should bring the firefighter's hat from the dress-up area. To not only anticipate, but to plan for that. Does that make sense? Okay. So by way of drawing all this together then, let me now move us from the learning foundation to previewing a little bit of the curriculum framework. How do we help young children develop a better sense of time? Now here's some of the ideas that we have in the curriculum framework for a sense of time. One, of course, is to use predictable routines to facilitate a child's sense of time. And when we depart from the routine, to do so with plenty of explanation about why this is so and how it deviates from what children ordinarily will expect. To talk with children about their experiences, asking questions to stimulate recall, and commenting on how current experiences relate to past events and anticipate future ones. We, through language, can draw the connections through time to help them be better mental time travelers than they ordinarily might be. We can use the language of time in conversation with children, words like before, tomorrow, in talking about past and future events. I've used the example of sleeps, referring to the numbers of days until something happens, because that was a nice rule of thumb that Janet used with both of our sons. A very abstract concept for a 4-year-old to capture a sense of multiple days. But to be able to say, it's 3 more sleeps before your grandparents visit, gives the child a mental benchmark slotted into their script for the day that they can count off. And that's much, much easier. To promote planning as children engage in child-initiated activities. This, by the way, also contributes to self-regulation in terms of planning, but to help use language to enable children to develop, if you will, a mini script for what they're going to do for the next while. We can introduce children to timekeeping tools such as clocks, calendars, even paper chains to count down the numbers of days to an event. If not sleeps, then 3 chains. And every morning you break off 1 because you're 1 day closer. Comment on how children themselves are changing over time. I should say comment positively on how children themselves are changing over time to give them that sense of growing skill, accomplishment, and a sense of their own development. And finally, enlist family members to talk about family history and their own experiences of the past. So let me pause at this point and ask you both what you would add to this list and what comments, questions you have about sense of time, about foundations for a sense of history. Yes?
When you were talking about the autobiographical memories,
Yeah.
I was also thinking about children are in that magical thinking stage as well. So if you ask what you did this weekend, they might say, oh, I went to Disneyland. The next little one's going to say, oh, I went to Disneyland too.
Yes.
So there's a kind of a blurring of how sort of,
Yes.
not truthful, but just their thinking is in that magical thinking at that stage.
Yes.
Can you comment on that?
Let me ask you, actually, from your experience, do you find this to be as true as children are into their 5th year as you do in younger children? Or does this begin to change as kids get toward the end of their preschool period?
I would think it they were not as doing as much magical thinking as they get older.
Yeah.
But when you ask them to tell their story, they often pick up on what the child knows. It's more, what you did was more interesting, so I'm going to do that.
Right, exactly. Well, it's not unusual. And part of the reason I asked the developmental question that I did is that if you don't have a strong sense of events in time, and if you are not also very strong at memory retrieval, part of what you may be seeing is say a 3 or 3.5-year-old, or even a 4-year-old, has absolutely no idea what they did yesterday. Disneyland is as good a response as anything else. If I draw a blank, then either make up something or take what the person before you said.
Which is fun and developmental as well.
Yeah. So that what you're, in other words, what you're seeing is what is often the result of children not having great skills at this age of memory retrieval, and so that's why you get magical thinking. And that's why it's something that diminishes as you get into the 5 and 6-year-olds. Kids are much, much better at spontaneously remembering, especially something in the recent past. And again, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll come back to the script and they'll say, well, I had dinner last night. Anything happen at dinner? Oh, yeah. A 3-year-old won't do that. Okay, it doesn't have the skills to be able to do that. So I think that's part of what you're seeing. Yes, it can make it amusing. Other comments, thoughts? Yes.
Well, as you were saying that, I was thinking how one strategy for us is to use what we know as their mental scripts.
Yes.
To help them anchor and prompt their memory.
Yes.
About what happened before dinner or after dinner. So just that's part of the discussion with kids. Because, I think the power of suggestion is what I was thinking when you said that, is how they, they may have even had something in their mind, but when the power of suggestion is something else, then like, oh, that's exciting, and then they just, what they had in mind disappears. And so it seems like you could really facilitate this development by having conversations around this related to what we know that their typical mental scripts are.
Yes.
And some kids are going to be more advanced, some kids are not, and just drawing out those things. And just gets their minds thinking about themselves in relation to others, in relation to their own life and their scripts.
Right. So, for example, if it was important for me to draw out from the child as accurate a representation as I can of what happened at dinner last night, perhaps because the mother had prompted me that something important had occurred, and it was good to talk with them about it, then that's exactly how I do it. So what happens when you come home from preschool? What does your mommy do then? And then get to the point of talking about dinner. And so then you have dinner. So what happened last night at dinner? You're exactly right. The scripts provide a structure from which you can then help them remember and anticipate what's going to happen in the future. Yeah.
And if you're worried about what they might say about their family life, it's like you can use your preschool script.
Yes.
As well. You're not ready to facilitate that description.
Right. Yes.
Ross, can you talk a little bit more about you've got on that if bullet introduce children to these timekeeping tools?
Yes.
We do see calendar being used in preschool a lot, but it seems very rote, very abstract. And what would be a developmentally appropriate way of using something around a calendar?
Well, it's not unusual to have it depends on what you mean by calendar. If I'm trying to get children to think in terms of it being February, next month is March, that's probably not very useful for kids of this age. Much more useful, perhaps, is talking about seasons, which then becomes embedded in changes in the ecology that by the time kids are 4, they've had enough experience that you can bring to mind with artifacts, with actual leaves and pictures to help them mark the changing of time. It's not at all unusual in a preschool program to have a picture chart that describes the routine of the day. So that would be one age-appropriate time marker for kids that would relate to the daily schedule. And I think if we were trying to go broader than that, if we were trying to anticipate events quite some time ahead, I'd have to think about that, because that is, again, anticipating things in the far distant, and by far distant I mean several days ahead, is still conceptually challenging for these kids. Anticipating it tomorrow, then, can sometimes be done with reference to that picture chart. Tomorrow, we're not going to have circle time. Tomorrow, we're going to go to the firehouse and see what firefighters do. And to get ready for that, here's something we're going to read today about what firefighters do. Is that helpful?
Yes,
Yeah.
very
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's the worry when you see introduce children timekeeping tools
Yeah.
and you see calendars on there, because that's something we really work to get teachers not to do, and you see often
Right.
spending 15 minutes, they're counting, they're putting numbers up, they're talking about the month,
Oh, yeah.
next week, and it takes this valuable time that would be better spent reading a story or going over a visual time schedule. And so just seeing it there, I can just see teachers right away going, well, it says calendars, we're supposed to do
Yeah,
calendars.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
that would be my only comment when we finalize this, that we are very, very careful about saying something like that. I personally think posting a regular calendar like in housekeeping is great, because that's a tool people use in their houses, although maybe not so much anymore. But to do that whole calendar thing when you circle time is not something we want to see.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've made a note to that. Here's where language can be an obstacle, not an assist. I was using calendars in a much more generic sense in the ways that we calendar events. But I need to make sure that we're clear, that we're not talking about that thing we get from, yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. That you put on the wall and think the children are ready to understand. Thanks. Yeah. Okay.
It's part of their daily routine
Good.
is to do the calendar.
Okay. And that's
So I think because they're using them, I think it'd be important for us to consciously and overtly, intentionally address the issue.
yes.
Which we've been doing with our on-site work. Yeah.
Good. Thanks for drawing that to my attention. We'll make sure we got that right.
I just wanted to make sure I didn't, make assumptions.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
And
Yes.
what goes with that for me is the clocks,
Yes.
that we
Yes.
really don't want them starting to teach time. A lot of them have
Yes.
those old wooden clocks.
Yep.
And so, I don't know, I just wanted to bring that one up too, that to think about how we express that to them, because it looks almost like first grade sometimes,
Mhm.
and the children aren't developmentally there.
Right. Whereas being able to anticipate something that's going to be occurring within the next hour
Right.
in terms of what the clock will look like, what this hand will look like. Or putting in children's hands a timer that helps them mark off time is a much more age-appropriate way of thinking about it. So this is very helpful. Thank you. Cindy?
I'd like to share a really positive calendar experience
Yeah.
with my own children when they were young, like 2 and 3. I bought a big calendar with big squares, and every night that was a part of our bedtime routine to
Yeah.
think of something that happened in their day. We would draw a little picture, and we would count the numbers and talk about how many days till the weekend or until a birthday. Talk about tomorrow and what happened yesterday.
Yeah.
And from a very young age, they had a very strong sense of time.
Right.
And I have seen some preschool teachers integrate that into their calendar time, and it's very meaningful.
Yeah. And then, of course, that's a lot different then, isn't it, from simply naming the months of the year and things like that. So you're right. I mean, that kind of artifact can be used as a teaching tool. But I think part of the message that I'm hearing is make sure that it's not misunderstood how you use it as a teaching tool. And these are very, very helpful comments. So thank you. Other thoughts before we go on, or are you ready to move on? Yes?
Are there class and other socioeconomic differences amongst preschool age children and how they come to the realization of time dimension.
Yes, yes.
Appropriate way to keep track of time.
So this is a very good point, and one that we worked hard to capture in both the learning foundations and the curriculum frameworks. Because when you and I talk about a timeline and a linear sense of time, not all cultural systems, indeed not all language systems, treat time in that linear sense. Likewise, when we read a narrative or tell a story, not all cultures have that sequence of going from one event to the other. And so there's language you'll find both in the bibliographic notes and examples in some of these foundations. And there's more material in the curriculum frameworks, pointing out the fact that different cultural systems, for example, tell stories differently, in which there may be a much more fluid sense of time. And it's not time, but emotion, which really marks the forward movement of the story. And that the tricky thing, and the reason it was important for us to understand this from people who are reviewing this and to incorporate it into the document, is that teachers need to see that not as an obstacle, or worse yet, as the wrong way, but instead to realize that what children may be reflecting, what parents may be showing, is a cultural pattern that can be actually incorporated into how we're helping children develop a sense of time. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because
I would think that socioeconomic situations probably give you some vast differences in that, because just the richness of events that are available for children to anticipate.
Right.
You know, we're going to Disneyland. If you're not doing much of anything that changes, it's a kind of monotony, and these economic times kind of underscore that. There's not much opportunity to develop that. Or is it the case that maybe that's just a cognitive portion of the development of any human?
Yeah. I don't know that there's much research looking at socioeconomic differences. And my sense is that where you find those kinds of differences, it may not be in the numbers of events that children can have to mark off time sequences, but what the events are. And the fact that we should always keep in mind that what children find really distinctive and memorable is not always what we think they ought to find distinctive and memorable. So that a child growing up in circumstances where they don't have the trips to Disneyland nevertheless is making a discovery on the way to school that for them makes that remarkable. Like the classic story of the father who takes his daughter to a ball game. And they come home and mother's waiting for them, and she says, well, how was the game? And from the father she gets a story of the score and the big plays and extra innings and all the rest. And from the daughter she gets the taste of the hot dog and the conversation of the guy in front, and oh, there was this guy selling, going up and down the stands, and completely oblivious to the game. And I suspect that might be where we're finding those differences too. Yes?
Can you explain a little more what you're talking about, stories that are not time sequence? What that would sound like?
I wish I could, because it's not from my cultural background, but this was described to us evocatively by some of our cultural informants. Does anybody have it from their own experience that can give a better explanation than I can? Yes?
Not my own, but in the Aboriginal cultures in Australia, they talk about dream time.
Yes, okay.
And it's this amorphous before we had recollection. And I love that metaphor.
I was told in some Latino communities that events are marked off, or stories are told, again, in terms of emotions and emotions of the participants, less than a linear cause-effect sequence of events precipitating other events. And that as a result, there's much more permission to recurse back to a previous event in understanding how a particular emotion. And again, it's nothing that's familiar to me, but it was described so richly by some of our cultural informants that we immediately recognized that this is one of those instances when cultural differences within a California classroom can lead teachers to see a particular child's way of responding as deficient, when it may be reflecting an indigenous pattern. Yes?
That's so true. When I did my timeline, I based it on emotions
Yeah.
that had an impact to this day still as to who I am
Yeah.
as a person and how I see the world.
Yeah.
And it's all just emotions.
Yeah. Yeah. It also relates, by the way, to how these children are telling autobiographical stories. So it may be hard to get a causal sequence of events from the child's narrative when what they're focused on is telling us how they felt. And so the response of an adult has to both affirm the feelings and then decide if it's necessary to probe for the causal sequence or not. I hope that's helpful a little bit.
I'd love to hear one.
Yeah. Well, we have some references to it. I think in the curriculum frameworks is when we wanted to make sure the teachers understood this. If you send it to me, I'll see if I can get some of the information. Okay. Yes?
Is there any research that shows that carries over into sequencing, like stories that was on one of your other slides, that they may not be, that children from other cultures may not be sequencing stories in the same way?
Yes.
That they might be saying something like they got angry instead of they ran away?
Sure, right. So
And that teachers might not recognize that?
this was part of the context in which it came up. So one of the things that you would expect a 5-year-old to be able to do, for example, is to retell a familiar story, putting the events in proper sequence. But if a child is coming from a cultural context in which narrative is not structured that way, they may be less ready to do so, or do so less readily. Now, I'm wanting not to make an argument that one ought to substitute one cultural form for another, because there is value in children understanding linear sequences in time for lots and lots of different reasons. The story really is one of understanding a cultural difference in how children may respond and working with it rather than resisting it. And that you'd also see in how they would be reconstructing a narrative. Okay? This is why I like talking with this group. I come out learning all sorts of things. Like a graduate seminar, right? Yes.
I wanted to share with everyone that when you talked about 2 sleeps,
Yes.
your wife was
Yeah.
using that
Yeah.
with your children. I'm particularly related to that because this summer I spent time in 10 Sleep, Wyoming. And 10 Sleep, it doesn't have an S on the end, it's just 10 Sleep, all one word. And it has petroglyphs in the rocks because that was a Native American site that was marked as it being 10 sleeps between there and 2 other people. And so that, it's interesting. It makes me wonder if maybe that's sort of in the back of her mind where she got that from. Maybe not from that place, but from the Native American use of the petroglyphs to show that.
10 Sleeps, Wyoming.
Yes, it doesn't have an S on the end.
Oh, 10 Sleep, that's right. Okay.
It's a town of 300 people, and I was there this summer.
Wow. Well, I don't know where Janet got that idea. Yeah, I suspect it wasn't from a trip to Wyoming, at least that I know of. But I wrote it down. I think I'm going to see if I can find that town. Are you ready to move on? And then we'll take a break? Okay. Was a yes, you're ready to move on, or was a yes, you want to take a break now? Okay, let's move on. We'll move on to the next one, and then we will take a pause because we're going to be moving into heavy material at that point.